All right, welcome back, guys, to the weekly Refold Roundtable. Uh, for this week, we have a really tough topic: pronunciation accent, learning, refining, correcting through immersion and practice, coursing, shadowing, what's awesome and what sucks. So today we have a very special guest, Darius, who he might know him from the Japanese server. He's a professional interpreter. He has been speaking Japanese for over 10 years, and he's apparently quite good at Japanese and accent in general. So today we're going to talk about what we found helpful, what we like and don't like, and just, different goals.
All right. Hi guys. I'm Darius. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I've been doing Japanese for like 13 or so years now, and you know, it was mostly a hobby at the beginning, and then slowly I started doing more serious things. While interpreting isn't my like full time job, I do it, occasionally throughout the year. And partway through, I realized that you kind of need good pronunciation to be intelligible when you're talking about sometimes difficult things. So I put a lot of time into various types of different pronunciation practice in Japanese. Some of you may know that pitch accent is notably difficult for many foreigners in Japanese. So I've used different methods and look forward to talking about them.
And then how about we go around the round table? So, Briz, I know that you're doing like a secret thing with Ethan, like some sort of chorusing, shadowing challenge between the two of you. Can
Yeah,
you talk a little bit
we
about
are.
that?
No, it's not a secret. So
Not a secret.
basically, Ethan and I have like a little contest in which, so we're both just starting to get into shadowing. I'm in stage 3A, roughly. And so what we're doing is basically how trying to log how many days in a row we can do shadowing. So not necessarily how long in a day, just getting into the habit of doing it because it's something new that we're adding to our routine, I guess, learning Spanish. And so currently the goals are shadowing anything for at least 20 minutes a day. And once you hit 20 minutes, that's it. We try to have a low goal, an easily achievable goal so that it's not, impossible or super overwhelming,
So it's not
especially in the
daunting.
beginning because it's hard. It's something that's I don't find natural. So getting into that habit has been interesting.
And
So I'm excited for this
do you
contest.
chorus or do you shadow? And is it native content or is it learner content?
I shadow. I do not shadow with the whole microphone setup. I shadow while I'm doing dishes because that's when I can pay attention best because, that's how my brain works. Um, and it's technically learner content, but it's native content as well. They're just it's a podcast for learners about Mexico and things like that. But they are native speakers.
Do we want to briefly define shadowing and chorusing for anyone who might not know?
Yes, that sounds like a great idea.
Okay. So I guess the basic idea is shadowing is the concept that's been around for quite long, and chorusing is sort of more the new kid on the block, but they're similar. And shadowing is when you're listening to content, you immediately after hearing it try to say it along with similar rhythm and similar like intonation, and just try to match things as much as possible. And chorusing is similar, but the difference between them is that shadowing is more you do it with like a longer piece of content, and you're more trying to get in like lots of words like over a lot of time that you just continue repeating. While chorusing is more about limiting it down to a specific smaller piece of audio, and really repeating that one and trying to match everything perfectly. Say it exactly at the same time as the speaker, and really nail the pronunciation. So that's how I would explain those two things.
Oh, that sounds like what Xiaoma Chris did uh, with the whole sentence recording. He would do it at the sentence level, essentially.
Hmm.
Okay.
Wow.
Cool. And me personally, I have not ever shadowed. I've never chorused. I have taught professionally and done accent reduction work, but unfortunately, with a lot of traditional learners, that's not going to apply here for like immersion learners because for a lot of traditional students, the only time they work on English is with their teacher. So I feel like a lot of what I do know and my experiences having been an accent reduction coach do not apply here.
Hmm.
I also have worked for over 2 years as primarily an accent and spoken English teacher, sort of working with students on understanding basically why they don't sound the way that native speakers do. I haven't had the exact same experience where it's like a lot of my students do a lot of English outside of their classes. I just cater to a different audience, I think. And I think a lot of the things do carry over, especially if you're not like hardcore immersion learning. Because I personally am of the opinion that just enough immersion will never necessarily help somebody have a native accent unless they're quite lucky and sort of blessed with the skills required to already acquire an accent, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, there's so much I want to say here. Have we finished our introductions, or anyone?
So we've got Shiki left, but she is still 2C, so she's not started outputting yet.
Yeah, I'm still just a new 2C. So I haven't done any kind of pronunciation practice, any kind of focused practice with pronunciation. But I have noticed just from getting input, it feels like to me my pronunciation is better than what it was before I started immersing. But of
Hmm.
course, it's not going to be any good compared to somebody who's done practice. But I would
Hmm.
say it's probably better than your average person
Hmm.
when it comes to Japanese.
I also want to
Yeah, so
clarify what I said a little bit, where I do think it absolutely can be learned, but there has to be, you won't just get it unless you end up being quite lucky. That's my point.
yeah, so I think this is a great first topic. So my thought of like how far can just immersion get you is that first off, immersion is a necessary step. It's not a sufficient one in acquiring a good accent, in the sense that you do need to hear a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the correct speech in order to even have a chance of getting it right. Um, and I would say one of the things that really makes a difference, or sort of determines how far you're going to get, is actually how well you are hearing things. So a big issue is that when you're listening to a second language, you may not have the right ear for it. Your perception might not be to the proper sort of level of granularity to pick up on all the facets of the language that you need to then be able to reproduce it later. Um, and if the issue is that your perception isn't good, you'll end up sort of learning things and memorizing things in a way that fits your like mental model at the time. And then when you reproduce it, it'll be from that mental model, which might not match up perfectly. So this is very common with Japanese, where you have pitch accent, and if you're coming from a stress accent language, you'll basically hear things as stress, which means you'll be missing some details, and you'll remember everything sort of slightly wrong. And then when you try to reproduce, it will, of course, be wrong.
Just
Um,
like with
yeah.
talking about chorusing and shadowing, can we define stress accent and pitch accent really quickly?
Ooh, yeah, sure. So let's start with stress accent. So in English, you have so-called stressed syllables and words, and they tend to be louder. They tend to be longer in length, the length of the vowel. And one other difference is that, at least in English, in unstressed syllables of the words, the vowels often change to be schwas
Mm-hmm.
instead of
Reduction.
normal. Yeah, reduction, exactly. So there's basically a number of things that change with the stress. Oh, one I forgot to mention is that the pitch does also tend to raise
Yeah.
with the stress.
And also, those
Um,
are set for most words,
yes,
except for depending on accent dialect, but there's a correct one for words.
a given word, right? Exactly. And often not just for a word, but for like specific compound words. And there's ways that
Mm-hmm.
stress change when you put adjectives on words, and like there's a whole system for it. And if you get one of these wrong, for example, like using a compound example, if you say train station instead of train station, it's not unintelligible, but it might be unusual in this scenario. So and the more of those you stack up, the odder you might end up sounding.
The interesting thing about this is that just like Japanese has variation in pitch accent systems, English also has some variation regionally with stress. For example, my dialect, we tend to prefer initial stress. So we would say theater, ambulance, and we would stress the initial syllable, which is sort of like the native Germanic style
Wait, can you
stress
say
system.
ambulance? Is that a possibility?
I don't think so.
Ambulance.
Oh yeah,
No.
ambulance.
That's standard.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can.
that's standard.
Okay.
Ambulance. Not me second guessing my entire existence speaking English.
Ambulance. Quick.
But
Ambulance.
regarding pitch accent, I don't know if you guys are aware, there are actually like 3 different things that are all called pitch accent. The term itself is not very good. So in Japanese, you've got what's basically a sparse tone system. But then, like Norwegian and Swedish, you have another type of so-called pitch accent that also has stress combined with it. So the tone or the pitch is determined by the location of the stress syllable. So it's sort of like pitch and stress combined. And you see that a lot with European languages that have pitch accents, so like
Stritch
Norwegian,
accent.
Croatian. And then there's another type of really nerdy thing called pitch accent, like F0 spikes, that you'd have to be like analyzing it with like Pratt to really get into. The fundamental frequency spikes are also called pitch.
So let me say, at least in Japanese, the way pitch accent works is it has one similarity to stress, which is that a given unit of the word is accented, and that accented part goes higher or lower in pitch. But it does not have any of the other things I mentioned. So vowels don't get longer, and they don't get louder, and vowels in the unaccented part of the word don't change. So it's easy to talk about this sort of linguistically like this, but when it comes down to perception, it can actually be pretty hard to hear this thing. And although like everyone will hear it to some degree, like hearing it in all scenarios and to the right level of granularity is definitely an issue that a lot of people have.
So hearing pitch is actually quite difficult. I took this test, kotsu.io, and I did 20 of them. I'm not like a real Japanese learner, but I got about 62% right, which to me is not much better than random chance, which tells me I just cannot hear it.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing, and it's interesting. Like people coming from different backgrounds, sometimes you have an easier time versus not. Like some people who have listened to a lot of Japanese do have an easier time. So it seems like you do slowly pick stuff up as you continue listening. And also, if you have some like music background, although it's not a guarantee, sometimes that can help. And usually the way it helps is that it helps you just be more analytical. Like you're like you start singing along with it and like trying to like figure out, oh, okay, that part was higher and this part is lower. And like if you're really musical, then you're like, this part is a semitone lower than that part, and like therefore there might not be a drop or there might be a drop there or something like that. And you can sort of build your own theory over time and figure it out. There's a lot of ways to go about it.
I do
We have
want
a
to
lot
ask
of musicians
something.
here in Refold, by the way. I know we have quite a few trained musicians. I know Atinius is. He rants about different types of do training and how they teach in China versus America. I'm sure that'll resonate with a lot of people here.
Gotcha.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Shiki.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So something that I think is one of the hardest things about pitch accent, when you're coming from like English, for example, is that in English, the stress will be linked to your emotions. So it's kind of hard to let go of that when you're trying to practice pitch accent. So I'm wondering how much emotion comes into it when it's in regards to pitch accent when you're speaking.
Right. So in the case of pitch accent, generally the accents don't change as a result of stress. Sorry, as a result of like emphasis or emotion.
Other kind of stress.
Yeah, the other kind of stress. And that isn't 100% true. For example, if you're shouting, accents tend to go away. There's just like no accents because your vocal cords are just so tensed up that like you're not modulating the pitch anyways. But stuff like that is sort of an exception. And otherwise, yeah, it just stays the same. So as a result, sometimes indeed when foreign learners of Japanese are speaking, like they want to emphasize a word which in Japanese may not have an accent at all, and they like try to figure out how to like emphasize it, and they like can't do it because there's no accent in the word. And in general, the way to do this in Japanese is you have to wait until there's an accent somewhere else and like group the whole thing, and then when you finally have an accent, lead up to that accent and maybe say that accent a little bit higher. And it's not intuitive because it doesn't necessarily come on the word itself that you're trying to emphasize. So yeah, there's a lot of difficulties like that.
That's super funny. How you have
Yeah.
to wait for an accent to get your emotion in.
Yep. Exactly. Uh, So yeah, not to go too deep on the rat holes with pitch accent, but I think one of the major points is that you do need to work on your perception, and like I think that is something that applies to pretty much any language, because in any language there's probably going to be some facet of the language which is not similar to your native language in the pronunciation. It might be some new consonants, it might be some new vowels that maybe in your native language would be considered to be the same vowel or consonant. And in that language, they are actually used to differentiate words, and there are minimal pairs which are involved with those sounds. Um, and in those cases, I think it's very valuable to earlier on do some ear training with any minimal pairs. So whether that be vowels or consonants, or maybe in a tonal language, you would be doing tonal minimal pairs. And then beyond ear training, also then like go through content and like single sentences and make sure for the whole sentence you're actually hearing all those things that don't exist in your native language properly, and maybe go and do some like initial reproduction practice too, to just make sure your ears are working on everything.
So I'm a big fan of minimal pair training.
Mhm.
And speaking of minimal pairs, that's usually where like a word and another word differ just by one sound. English has a lot of these, but they're kind of like slanted minimal pairs where usually there's also like a vowel quality change as well. As
Mm.
far as I know, my favorite example is insight and insight. Those are two different words. INCITE,
Mhm.
INSIGHT.
Mhm.
And that's a true minimal pair. Incite violence, and insight. I have insight into how Ben thinks.
And right, that's a stress minimal pair, right?
Correct. That's a stress
Yes.
minimal pair.
Yeah.
No vowels are differentiated. It's like a true stress minimal pair that English surprisingly does not have a lot of.
Hmm. Right. It seems to be a lot of them for noun versus verb, right? Desert or
Right.
dessert.
But there's also a
But there's a
vowel
slight
quality
vowel
change with
change, is what
that,
he means.
like
I
record and
see.
record.
Yeah, you're
Is
right.
actually a
Object,
whole different
object.
vowel.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So
I didn't know that.
speaking of minimal pairs, did you do any minimal pair training with Japanese?
So in my case, no, because I was not aware of that concept when I was starting, and as a result, let me talk a little bit more about my journey, perhaps. When I was initially learning, I did it primarily via audio. I was watching a lot of anime, and then I eventually started like making friends and talking to friends. And I really didn't do anything reading based for quite a long time. I was maybe 6 years in until I started learning how to like read kanji and read books, and I was already conversationally fluent at that point. So I was a very much audio-based learner, and despite that, I actually didn't really fully pick up pitch accent. Like I got it on some words, of course, but like uh, even though I was aware of it, so I was aware of it like as a concept because I was into linguistics, and like it's one of the main interesting things about Japanese. But simply being aware that it exists was not enough. So uh, it's really not enough to just, even if you're a really heavy audio immerser, um, it wasn't enough in my case. Though it was enough for vowels and consonants for me. And I think that may also vary by the person because, for example, in English, I always like doing like dialects and different accents in English, and like um, I don't know, that was sort of like easy for me to pick up. But the pitch accent was just too subconscious, like I wasn't able to be aware of it, so that was more difficult.
And how did you begin to like recognize pitch with Japanese?
Right. So this was actually fairly recent. This was maybe 3 years ago, where, you know, bring it to the next level of not just knowing it for some like random words, but rather like really starting to fill out my pitch for all the words I know properly. It happened because I was actually just talking on Discord in a voice chat, and uh, my friend Isaac uh, was in there, and he was like, I think you're saying yappari wrong because it's a word in Japanese, and I was saying it yappari, and the correct pronunciation for it is yappari. And I'm like, that's such a basic word that I hear all the time and say all the time. Like, if I'm getting the pitch wrong on that, I must be getting it wrong on like so many other things. Um, and this caused me to be like, okay, maybe there's something I need to look into. And I asked one of my Japanese friends, hey, like, what do you think? Do you hear any mistakes I'm making? And they came back and they're like, oh yeah, you made a mistake on this word and that word. And it really like opened my eyes to like the amount of work that was required to get better here. And from there to actually become able to hear it and remember it better, the strategy that I primarily used was doing corrected reading. So reading stuff out loud
Mhm.
and getting corrections from a native speaker on what I was saying for the pitch accents. And I have to say it was extremely effective. Um, Not only does it like give you corrections for specific words you're getting wrong, but it also really helps your perception. Because to even be able to understand the corrections, like you need to be hearing it and then be able to say, oh, sorry, I said X, but it's actually Y. I get it. And like if you're not like correcting yourself properly, they're going to be like, no, it's Y, not what you just said, right? Like there's that really tight feedback loop of like getting able to like improve your perception by like talking about the pitch in a conversation. Um, and that was really powerful for me. So once I did maybe like a couple sessions, maybe like 3 or 4 hours of worth of this like correction, my perception was like just on a different level already. Um, and then from there is a matter of actually going through and correcting everything. But man, how much I wish I had like done those 3 or 4 hours earlier on, just to like get a better conception of like this whole facet of the pronunciation that I was missing.
This has
That
opened up a whole can of worms. I have so many questions, and I know the audience does too. But one slightly off topic question is, do you know any other languages beyond English, even just a little bit?
So, if we're talking about just a little bit, yes. So, I grew up in a Iranian household. I was born in America, but my parents are Iranian. Therefore, I speak some Farsi, and it's bad. It's bad, man. It's bad. However, the my pronunciation isn't that bad in it, and that's I guess one of the benefits of doing something from childhood. And I found that it maybe did help in a couple places when learning Japanese. Just having a wider set of vowels and consonants, and flexibility and in understanding the whole spectrum of
And
possibilities.
Farsi is got a similar grammar in that it's agglutinative, right? Sort of like
Mhm.
Japanese, where you have a lot of suffixes that stack on each other. That might
Yeah,
have also
yeah,
helped.
and maybe I'm sure it would if my Farsi was better. I don't want to like I can barely like say anything in Farsi. It's bad. And the other similarity I guess is that it's subject object verb, um, which is similar to Japanese. Though the relative clauses get stacked in the opposite way, so there are some differences. But yeah.
And you mentioned that you were doing this sort of like corrected reading. Did you
Mhm.
also do shadowing or chorusing in addition to that?
Yeah, so I didn't do shadowing or chorusing as a practice, in the sense of like regularly allot some time and like um, set up my headphone and mic or something. Um, However, I would say that shadowing is something that I constantly did while I was just immersing. Um, so like while I was watching anime or just any audio content, I naturally like noticed things that would probably be hard for me to say smoothly, and I would just practice them, either by like pausing what I was watching and saying it, or just looping it in my head, like sub vocalizing it a ton until I feel like I was able to say it. And in some cases where they were hard, like I would sit with like something I found difficult for like maybe 30 minutes or something and like figure out how to say it properly. And it was just sort of like an intuitive thing I did because I was like, this is hard to say and I want to know how to say it, so I got to practice.
So you intuitively found like a way to get your sort of I guess this would be more like shadowing, right? If you're
Yeah,
just kind of like free
exactly.
flowing your shows and repeating.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot
That's
of the times,
interesting.
yeah, I did it because it was fun, honestly. Like it was a challenge, and sometimes there's like cool lines in anime, which like it's
Mhm.
a little like nerdy, but like you want to be able to like say them, and like it can be difficult because they're like professional voice actors saying difficult lines, and it's just fun to like try and do it yourself.
If
Now, you
oh,
speaking of pitch, uh, sometimes there's like regional variations in accent and such.
Mm,
I'll give an English example for the audience. So I'm from the South. I've got the pen merger. That means
mm,
that I pronounce the short e and the short I the same before nasals. So for example, pin and pin, ink pin, push pin, tin. I have tin cans. So the same vowel for me.
mm.
Bin or Ben is from the West Coast and does not do this. So sometimes when we
Ben,
co-work together,
you mean?
we we have miscommunications.
Ben.
I said the word min something something, and he's like, "Who's min?" And he thought it was a name. I'm like, "No, men with an eh." So do these sort of variations in pitch accent ever affect your comprehension when you're listening to someone outside of the standard Tokyo pitch accent sort of
Mhm.
framework?
Yeah, so this is definitely a whole can of worms. And maybe to add some context to the whole question, a lot of people hear that there are pitch differences between dialects in Japanese, and then sort of either get told or reach the conclusion themselves that therefore pitch accent doesn't matter because everyone speaks different anyways. And the truth of the matter is that while there are differences, they are very consistent within the dialect. And you hear different dialects, especially if you're a Japanese person who grew up in Japan. But even as a foreigner, you at least regularly hear standard Japanese and Kansai Ben, the Kansai dialect. Um, and you can tell that when someone is from one of those areas because they speak differently. Part of that is different word choice, but a big part of it is the intonation and pitch accent. Um, and as a result, either as a native speaker or as a learner, you build your own conception of okay, in Kansai it sounds like this, and in standard Japanese it sounds like this. And to some degree, people will like have a conscious understanding that maybe something like hashi and hashi, which is a like very famous minimal pair, that they're
Like
opposite in
bridge and
standard,
chopsticks.
yeah, bridge and chopsticks, that they're different between standard Japanese and Kansai Ben. But that level of detail of like understanding like a specific minimal pair is different in another dialect is hard for a lot of people, even native speakers. But certainly it won't sound unnatural because like you hear the person speaking Kansai Ben, they say something with a different pitch accent, and you're like, yeah, I think I've heard it said that way before, and like it sounds natural. This is very different from listening to a learner, and they're just getting like pitches, unusual pitches on like every single word, and like there's no consistency, and it sounds very confusing and difficult. So it there are some comprehension difficulties between like dialects sometimes, but usually they're resolved by context and like having some low level of familiarity with the pitches in the other dialect, I would say.
I
And
want
I
to
guess Kansai Ben
touch.
is
Oh,
like, sorry, I'll finish this and I'll let you go
okay.
ahead, Ben. I guess Kansai Ben is common enough that
Yes.
most people are vaguely familiar with it.
Oh yeah, for sure. All of the like comedy in Japan comes out of the Kansai region, and therefore, like if you watch TV, like a good quarter or more of the shows are like from the Kansai region, and everyone from childhood usually has had exposure to it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
I want to use this to sort of touch on the idea of consistency through accents as well, because I think that's really important. And then you also mentioned earlier, like your interest in doing sort of other accents in English and sort of
Mhm.
talk about first the idea that one way that somebody can, quote, learn an accent like in their native language is because you don't have to relearn every single word. You just basically learn what patterns are different or what things are different and sort of what they take the place of in other accents. Oh, you say oh instead of oh or whatever it might
Right.
be, and that's just all the time. You don't have to relearn every single word with an o in it and that
Mhm.
kind of thing. And that brings
Yeah,
me to my sort
exactly.
of
Yeah.
question to you more directly.
Mhm.
How much sort of care or thought have you put into your own English and then also into these other accents that you've done? And are they actually quite good? Are they sort of more for fun, or do you sort of just enjoy it? Or talk a bit more
Yeah,
about
so
that.
they're absolutely just for fun, and I almost don't want to reveal any of them here because they're probably pretty bad. Like if you were a native speaker of that accent, um, and exactly like you were saying, it's fairly easy to do the overarching sort of qualities of a given accent. But then when it comes down to the details, that's where you will immediately be found out. Uh, with British English, there's like sometimes different stresses on words.
Trap bath.
I'm not sure.
Oh, with those
Yeah,
ones. Okay, yeah.
yeah. I don't know if I'm actually remembering this correctly, but maybe coffee is accented, stressed differently in British English. I don't quite remember. But there's like just like
They
hundreds.
definitely they
Cafe
definitely
is
have a different vowel,
Yeah.
coffee.
but
Coffee.
yeah, they've got a
Yeah.
rounded vowel there. And most Americans, we don't have it. You
Mm-hmm.
actually, if you ever listen to Shiki, you can hear her Florida accent because she unrounds aw before r in some
Mm-hmm.
places where I wouldn't, like orange or Florida. She
Oh,
doesn't do it
orange?
often, but
Mm-hmm.
occasionally she has that father vowel ah where I would expect an
Orange.
o.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Something I recently was told about my English is that I had the wrong stress on chimpanzee. I'm curious how you guys say it. I sort of primed you with that.
Chimpanzee.
I stress the
Okay.
Oh
Z.
no,
Chimpanzee.
I suddenly forgot what I say.
Right.
Chimpanzee.
She
Okay.
primed
Chimpanzee.
us, yeah.
So
Chimpanzee.
No,
yeah,
Chimpanzee.
it's a
Chimpanzee.
chimpanzee.
yeah. I said
Chimpanzee.
I.
Chimpanzee. I don't know.
So
I
yeah, I
saw
grew
the
up.
chimpanzees at the zoo.
I grew up saying it chimpanzee, I think, because that's how I was saying it. And someone was like, "That's not the right accent." And if you like look it up in a dictionary, I think chimpanzee is like the recommended, the one that comes first. So I was like, "Huh, that's interesting." I also used to say pronunciation incorrectly. The word pronunciation. I
Oh,
used to
same.
say I used to say pronunciation.
Yeah.
And like even as a native speaker, like there's all these things, and you might consider them to be like prescriptive things that you get corrected on as you grow up, and like what is it really wrong? But there's still all this stuff that you may not even notice as a kid growing up, or like variations between you and other people around you.
That's also just
um,
diving into the whole spelling thing, right? There's
yeah.
so many words, and like, or do you say determined or determined, or all these random
Mhm.
things?
So
Like,
speaking of chimpanzee,
yeah,
Ben, I just pinged you with three different transcriptions of it, and some of them do have different stress. Do you want to read those three, the three variations of
sure.
chimpanzee in English?
Chimpanzee, chimpanzee, chimpanzee. Sorry,
So there's
chimpanzee,
initial stress, there's
chimpanzee,
stress on the second syllable,
chimpanzee.
and stress on the third syllable. So it looks like every single syllable can be stressed depending on the dialect.
Mhm.
So
So we're
a
all
lot of
right.
variation in the word chimpanzee. I wouldn't worry too much
Chimpanzees,
about
cool
it.
guys.
I would also raise that but that's just
The ah,
yeah.
the ash tensing for the
Chimpanzee,
n.
yeah,
I do it
chimpanzee.
too because I'm American. So
Woo.
I say chimpanzee. Speaking of accent, moving away from pitch for a second. So
Yeah.
Japanese does have regional variation, but I'm not sure like how intense it is. But there is something like we were talking about the pin pen merger earlier.
Mm.
There's something called the four kana merger, right? And
Mhm.
different dialects have merged. So like Middle Japanese had four distinct sounds, four distinct phonemes. They've merged into a two-way system in Tokyo, but some have merged them further and some haven't merged them at all. Do you ever encounter like sort of very strong accents that do cause like some sort of it impedes communication? Or is
Uh,
that not so common with Japanese?
no, it is a thing. So among the younger generation, it's not so much a thing because everyone grows up with standard Japanese TV, and there's a lot of social pressure to, speak like that when you're, you know, speaking in a more general context with people you don't know, or like someone who might not be from the same areas from you. However, in the older generation, there's still a bunch of people who have quite thick accents, and like if especially if you go to the countryside and like start talking to like people at a older folks at a random bar or something, it could easily get to the point where you have no idea what they're saying.
And have you ever run into any of these, like in media or in your trips or anything?
Oh yeah, for sure. I remember one time I was I was traveling. I was stopping for like one night in Nagoya, which is a city in Japan. And I was only there for a day, and my hair was super long, so I had to get my hair cut. And I was like, okay, I'll just go quickly like walk into some random barber shop and get my hair cut. And I just walk into one, and the guy there is like, I don't know, probably like 70 or 80 or something. I'm like, awesome, I need a haircut. And he's like, sure. He sits me down and like starts telling me all about Nagoya. And I probably could only understand maybe like 30% of what he was saying because of how thick his accent was. And at the time, I was fluent. I was fluent in Japanese and could understand normal people just fine. And it was purely just the like his pronunciation and accent that made it difficult to understand.
So it was purely phonetic. It wasn't like the grammar in this dialect is strange, or they've got different
No,
particles, or
yeah, I mean,
totally just accent,
there
accent
might
word
have
choice
been
maybe.
there might have been some word choice in there too, but I would say it was like 95% accent.
That's wild.
Yeah. Yep.
So, yeah, Ben, you are doing Spanish, which is like got a very big global spread. And what I hear from the Spanish learners is that it's quite brutal going between dialects, but it sounds like Japan is, for most people, a lot more homogenous when it comes to regional variation.
Yeah, I think it probably just has to be because there's so many different countries and parts of the world that speak Spanish and islands and communities and inside of other countries, right? There's just I mean, like, I'm not to say that Japanese is also not very varied, but yeah, there's very, very different accents that you can find in Spanish all over the Spanish speaking world.
And that is also a merger, by the way. Very, very is
Yep,
another merger. Some people would say very varied.
very varied, very
Mergers
varied.
all around, y'all.
Nope, I have all the mergers pretty much. Caught,
I
caught. Oh,
You don't
not
have
pin
the
pan.
pin
No,
merger.
that's not true.
Ah,
Lot palm. Uh,
father
close.
bother.
Yeah, bother. Anyways, um, in Spanish, there's a lot of pretty big changes, and the ones that I find most interesting are also the almost kind of what I like to sort of think of as the vibe changes, and that's like just the way that people sort of put their words together. Like even if you completely got rid of all the words and just use like the tonal variation and sort of how they modulate their voice, you can still often guess what country you're listening to or what country's accent or what accent from a part of a country. Like it's a lot more nuanced than I'm making it sound, but you can get pretty close just by the vibe of the way they say it. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we listen for as a native speaker of a language.
Since I'm from Florida, the Spanish Cuban accent really sticks out to me. Like I recognize it right away, and it feels
Mhm.
very familiar.
And this is the reason that I think, like, if you meet somebody who speaks your target language natively, and you like introduce yourself, like if even if you introduce it well, they go, "Oh, your X is great," and you go, "I said 7 words. How do you know?" And they're like, "Oh, it just sounds good." And we do that sort of same thing in English often with people. When you hear like a learner who has just a good vibe with their speaking, that's the thing that I think ends up being the most important sort of for our what natives perceive as the most native like. Um, sure, if you go further and there's like you can find, oh, that was a little mistake. Oh, that was a little mistake. But I think the vibe is like one of the most important things to really pick up in a target accent that you're trying to really be able to use. Is what does it vibe like?
Yeah. And I think
Listener
this brings up
perception.
a good point of, pronunciation is one facet of naturalness in the language, right? And like just although it matters, you don't need to necessarily purely focus on it if you're just working on your naturalness overall. In the sense that one of the things that really helped me sound more natural was just copying in general. So I found some speakers in Japanese who I thought were really, really effective at like
Mm-hmm.
speaking and like being fun and driving a conversation well. And I would just like sort of analyze what they do, try to like copy it and use it in my own speech. And like even when I would like go out with friends, like out of the friend group, I'd be like, who here is like doing the best job of like being funny and whatever, and just like try to like copy their mannerisms and behaviors and whatever, and just constantly like make it a practice to uh, try to gain the things that make you like an actual good speaker, because even within native speakers there's quite a bit of variation of like how well spoken or how funny or like how interesting someone sounds. And like if you make an effort to copy the good people, then I found, at least in my experience, that that helped a lot in building like a really natural, smooth vibe.
Now, to reel back just a sec, Vanessa, or sorry, Shiki, you were saying that to clarify, your husband is Guatemalan, right?
Yeah,
And you
so
have
his
like roots in Spain, like your dad, maybe your grandma.
yeah, my dad grew up speaking Spanish as a kid, and then when he started school here in Florida, he pretty much lost his Spanish ability. And my abuela, uh, her family's from Spain, so her mother, great grandmother, came from Spain.
Okay, so you're sort of like not a Spanish speaker per se, but you're like kind of like a really weak heritage speaker, but you've definitely had exposure.
Yeah, I grew up having Spanish immersion, just hanging out with my abuela so much. Like she
And
was
how
like
about with
my
your
second
husband?
mother. um, I have I have him translate Spanish TikToks for me, and I've met his I've met his mother, of course, and she speaks Spanish to me, and I don't really have trouble understanding her. And I'll just speak back in English, and we'll just converse that
So you
way.
guys crosstalk.
Yeah,
That's cool. I mean, it's cool. We've got a really like diverse group of people here. We've got teachers, we've got heritage Persian speakers, heritage Spanish speakers. It's a nice mix. So I guess with Japan being one country, you would think it would be super homogenous, and that
Mm.
might not have been the case. It is pretty probably homogenous now, but I guess going back like 100 years ago, it's sort of like when you go to England, the accent changes like every couple of miles. Whereas
Right.
in like America, to me as an American from the South, I think that everybody from the West sounds the same. I noticed that Cloudy and Ben have the same accent. They both say both with an L for both, despite one being from Utah and one being from Oregon.
Mm.
In the
So I
U.S.
imagine Japan
specifically,
was pretty diverse in the past. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead, Ben.
So go ahead, Ben.
no, I was just going to talk about more about the U.S. and its accents because, yeah, a lot of the West Coast ends up being the same. There's some more specificities if you go to like rural areas. But if you look east, that's where you get a lot more diversity and variation in accents. South and the east of the country, just because it's older and there's a little more isolated certain parts. But yeah, anyways, go back to the Japanese thing. I butted in.
Yeah. So I would say, while it's not as clear as, for example, Spanish, where many of the places of speaking are separated by bodies of water, but it there was certainly a lot more variation if you even just go back like a generation or two, and that's simply because there wasn't as much mixing, there wasn't as much shared media throughout the country, and as a result, there's more diverse accents. Japan has a really, really long history, including the capital, like moving all over the place. And with that came like shifts in accent. And of course, there's like a lot of importing of like Chinese words. And that had a big effect on the accent system. It's thought that that's where a lot of like the tonal aspects came from in the first place. Um, and so yeah, there was a lot of variation, and you just constantly see it slowly fading away as things become more homogenous.
Speaking of Chinese influence on Japanese, Japanese has to be the worst Sino-Zinic language out there for accurately like representing Chinese loanwords. Uh, just based on like, so for example, Wang, right, in Chinese, you would expect we spell it usually in English Wong, like as a family name,
Yeah,
has transmuted into O, a long
yeah.
O sound in Japanese. They've just
What?
totally done a bang up job. Yeah, so they didn't have like coda consonants at some point, so they borrowed it as like wow, and then eventually that ow diphthong smoothed into an O, and a whole bunch of this has happened. Like, it's like the worst game of the telephone game in term like history that I have seen. Granted, I'm not that experienced with like loan words, but Japan does a bang up job at making Chinese words unrecognizable.
Yeah, that I guess that's what happens when you import them, and then they also get changed within Japanese, like throughout the years as well, because they were imported a long time ago, and just constantly get sort of more corrupted over time. And Japanese also doesn't do a great job with with English loan words, where sometimes they are very, very hard to understand. I remember someone was talking the other day about the word pochi, which is like pouch, and there's another import of it, pouchi. And like you have pochi and pouchi, and they're like both imports of pouch from English, and it's like
Are they
sort
both
of
from English?
yeah, they're both from English, yeah.
So I've
uh,
heard that with a lot of the gairaigo, the loan words,
yeah.
some look English, but they might actually be Dutch. Like I've heard that biru and doru are all actually Dutch loans that look like English.
Yep, that can definitely happen. In this case, I double checked with the dictionary, and it was all from English. So I thought it was interesting that sometimes the vowels can get pretty far away from what they should have been, and I guess that's just how it goes.
So with Filipino, uh, one thing that you see a lot is older loans are less recognizable. I have a few theories. One is the less
Time.
contact they had with the language, not just time, the less contact they had with the language, uh, the more difficulty they had with certain phonemes. Uh, but a lot of like words were re-borrowed at a later date. For example, the word for hat in Filipino is sombrero, which sounds a lot like Spanish. But there's also a variant that's older, sumbalilo, which you can see they've added a vowel to break up the consonant cluster, and then the R has kind of like lambdacized. It's become an L. So you see these sorts of like older loans get re-borrowed back later, and they sound a lot more like the original source.
What
And
do
I
you
think
think of
Japanese does that too.
what do you think of sombrero? Because that's the Japanese loan of it.
It definitely sounds nativized. They've
Okay.
added that extra vowel to break it up.
Yep.
But none of them sound like the Spanish, right? All sound a little bit different. Speaking of loans, a good one for me is the word "t" in Japanese. So we know that pretty much even in like Middle Chinese, literary Chinese, it was cha, right?
Hmm.
But you have kisaten, right? Which is like I guess like a coffee shop or a tea shop. And it's got a very nativized reading of the word tea. But
Hmm.
then the actual drink you would probably call ocha, right? Which is a lot more like what you would expect it to be.
Yeah. So another place where you see that sa reading is sado, which is like the tea ceremony stuff. But it can also be read chado. So like there's just some places where the cha character can be read both ways. I'm actually not sure where the sa reading comes from. You could probably find out from a kanji dictionary.
Okay, I want to jump in
Uh,
here for these. We have about 10 minutes left here. I think we should go back to talking about either chorusing and shadowing, or discuss more about like how one can do the reading practice sort of thing, so that we give people some actionable things to try to work on their own spoken language.
well,
Mm.
given that we're not very experienced as a group with chorusing and shadowing, I'm happy to give Darius the mic again and let him sort of talk about corrected reading and how to actually go about that.
Yeah, that's
There
also the
there were
thing.
some audience questions there was a couple.
I know we've neglected you guys in the audience this time. It's just
I
been
can
such like
read
a
one.
massive.
There's one that was about the I forgot what you guys call the similar words. Sorry. Uh what did you guys call them? Uh wow. Okay, I just took over and then didn't know what I was going to say. Oh, here we go. What should I do if I'm hard stuck on kotu.io? I'm stuck at
Komatsu.io.
60%. Yeah.
So
Mm.
So
that's one of
that's
those
from
pitch
Hanunu.
accent tests, I think.
Yep. Yep.
He's
Yep.
getting about 60% right, which is basically as good as guessing, right?
Hmm.
How would you
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
So
about
is there like
improving that?
a good strategy for improving it?
Mm-hmm. I would say there's two strategies. One is to be analytical, like open up Audacity, like do the pitch contours, and like just break it down until you get it. That works for some people, like people who like to be analytical and like to look at graphs of stuff and whatever, that may also not be for you at all. So you probably know just from hearing the idea which one of those two types of people you are. So if you're the type of person who is not interested in that sort of thing, I would say the best way to do it is actually going like back and forth between doing the test and then actually trying to reproduce and like get corrections, because like I was saying earlier, getting corrections really can help your perception, and like talking with a native speaker about the pitch, and they will just you have a tight feedback loop in that case, so it can really help you improve your perception. So that's what I would recommend.
And to be
You
clear,
mentioned
this
earlier
isn't just a
too about
Japanese thing. You can do it with if you're having trouble hearing differences between things in any target language.
Yeah.
and earlier you talked about people who tend to be musical
Mhm.
have an easier time with that. Do you
Yep.
think that like humming along or really trying to listen to like the musicality of it if you're into music would help with that? Because I think I did it just like for kicks and giggles. And
Mhm.
I used to be a music major a long
Yep.
time ago in a past life. And I was able to do it, but it took a significant amount of work. I got, I think, 80% or something, but I was humming along with it all and really
Mm.
trying to feel in my throat, like, is it higher or lower? And
Mm.
some of it was guessing, but
Yeah,
I feel like humming really helped.
that does help. And if you try to analyze it like that, you'll hit a different set of problems than someone not doing it that way. The set of problems you'll hit is like you notice, okay, with heiban words, which are the flat words in Japanese that don't have accents, they like do like drop slightly at the end. They go down like a semitone on like the last one or two moras. Why doesn't that count as a drop? And
Yes,
like,
yes.
yeah, like you will
Yeah.
go through that process and you will like build your own model of like, okay, what is an accent, what isn't an accent, and then once you analytically understand it, then you will go through and like do more of the tests, and then eventually that will turn into like a an actual intuition about this is accented or not.
Interesting.
So you can go through that like analytical stage as a stepping stone to building the
Gotcha.
intuition. Yeah.
We got another question from Minor.
Mhm.
And this is a pretty common question. Do you specifically, Darius, do you recommend starting to shadow early or waiting until you can distinguish all the sounds or maybe waiting somewhere in the middle? Like when do you think would be the best time, like you personally, not necessarily Refold, but you
Mhm.
personally, when do you wish you started shadowing or doing this sort of work?
I think you don't need to care about the timing that much. So once you are listening to stuff and like you're like, I want to be able to say the same thing, I think it's fine to that point to just try and copy it. There's not that much harm in it, in my opinion. Um, I mean, maybe if we're talking about like doing hours of shadowing a day or like something intense like that, then maybe you might want to hold a little bit until you have some confidence that you're doing it correctly, so you don't build bad habits with it. But I
That's
think
also
certainly,
really hard in
yeah,
the beginning. I'm
yeah,
struggling with 20 minutes.
right. So like, I think for that small amount of time, there's very little downside risk of just trying it out. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep. So yeah, I guess I do want to speak a little bit about how do you actually do corrected reading, because
Go
this
for it.
is, yeah, a question I hear a lot. Um, so there's different ways to go about it. The thing that most people are usually worried about when they hear about this strategy is, for example, I'm still like a level one or a level two in Refold, and I'm not supposed to be speaking yet. How am I going to like find a native speaker to correct my reading? Should I even be doing it at that level? So these are all things that I hear a lot. Um, and in my opinion, you absolutely can do it at an earlier stage in Refold, and you just want to adjust for what you're doing. So you probably will be hard to like make a native friend necessarily that will do it for you, but you can absolutely go on italki, uh, just find a random native speaker who knows some of your native language, and just be like, I want to read out some stuff and specifically get pitch, accent, and pronunciation corrections from you on the passage. And you can just try that for like an hour or something. And again, there's very little downside risk. The only downside risk is to your like to your anxiety filled brain of like, oh god, will they not like me, or will I sound silly, or something like that. But there's no downside risk to your language learning ability, and there's only upside risk of like you might be able to unlock an entirely new level of perception in some whole facet of the pronunciation you're missing when they're like correcting half of your words. Um, and I think that's very powerful. And I do recommend it at pretty much any stage. You will know yourself how much you care about like pronunciation and sounding good, and you can adjust yourself for how much time you want to put into it earlier on. But I think pretty much it's a safe thing to do. Um, and in
Like,
terms of specific, oh, go ahead.
I'll just add on a little bit, but I
Yep.
think you once you finish what you're going to say just now, as I feel like it might
Yep.
be similar.
Yeah, sure. In terms of specifics, what I would recommend is if you find a tutor or something, you should drive the process because people may not necessarily be familiar with this type of practice. So what I would recommend is you go with a prepared thing that you want to read. And my recommendation is if you're starting out, it should be something very, very simple. If it's Japanese, it should have like furigana on it, so you're not having issues with the kanji. And it should be probably like a graded reader of some sort, where you're not struggling with like the vocab or like any other aspect of it. It's so you can focus on the pronunciation, and then you just go through. You start reading, and important is that you stop very frequently and confirm that everything was okay. Because if you just plow through it, a native speaker will, if they're not practiced at this, they won't be able to stop you. They won't know how many times they should correct you, if they're going to make you feel bad, or whatever. So the important thing is to say a really simple sentence, stop, be like, are you sure I said everything correct there? Or was there a detail that I missed? And just do that after every sentence, and then they will get the idea of what you're looking for. And that is a good way to go about it, in my opinion.
Yeah, just to add on a
Right.
little bit, I
Oh,
recently
go ahead, Ben.
started doing this in my classes almost exclusively because I found it to be one of the most effective and repeatable and useful things for students, especially those at a higher level and at a lower level. And I sort of split it into two different things where, like, the lower level students who maybe still have trouble with understanding or any kind of fluid speaking, I wrote quite simple conversations between a person A and a person B that could be natural, right? They could be just normal conversations, but they're intentionally generic. So it uses very common language that they also get the handle on the things that come up again and again and again and again. I also made recordings for them so that they have things to practice with. And that if you are quite sort of like maybe stage 2A, 2B, 2C, somewhere in there, and don't really speak a ton but want to do this, I'd say find some very simple conversations, like Darius said, and try to get good versions of those because that will expand to the rest of the language. English is English, no matter if you're talking about uh, rocket science or mac and cheese, right? It's all the same sounds and words and vibes, like I said. And for slightly more advanced people, students, I just read an article with them or a book or whatever, and I help them try to figure out what makes them like the way that it sounds and sort of how I would do things. And we sort of discuss a lot of little things. We, for like a, I don't know, 30-minute session, we probably read like 4 or 5 sentences. Honestly, you do not get very far if you're being really, really picky. If you're being sort of mid picky, then you can get further, but it really depends on that level. So definitely don't blow by a teacher, especially if they don't do this all the time, because they will probably correct things once or twice and then let things go because they want to move on. Whereas the actual content is not as important as actually getting the reps in and understanding what's going on and why something sounds better or worse.
100%. And you can vary those strategies. Like you could have a session where you go deep, like on a couple sentences once, and then you can have another session where it's more about just getting the stuff that sticks out a lot on a bigger like passage. And I don't think it hurts to mix the strategies.
Absolutely.
All right, and guys, we are at time. Before we go, I want to give everybody a big thanks for coming today. Darius, it's our first time having you here on Refold Central.
Thanks for having me.
Ben, thank you so much for handling like the audio quality and the recording because I just don't have the experience with it.
Of course.
This was a totally different roundtable than last time. It was sort of more focused on one person. We didn't take as many audience questions. So we're still growing into it. We're still experiencing. And as we get like more and more listeners and more people talking, we'll have to sort of like finalize how it goes. So if anybody's like a listener from like the beginning, from like 8 weeks ago. It was a little bit different today, but thank you guys for coming. I'm going to leave the stage channel chat open if anyone wants to keep talking for the next 5 minutes, and we'll wrap it up. And hopefully, you guys will vote, and we'll see you again next week at the weekly Refold Roundtable podcast.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
guys.